the construct of the American dream really feeds into this idea that assimilation is exceptionalism. When you conform, when you abide by the rules, you will be treated differently. You are special. Nothing bad will happen to you. And on the other hand, as an adult, I can look back at that critically and understand how and why that's a farce. I also get that for a lot of the folks who were in the generation above me, assimilation was a survivalist tactic.
Press the button to begin.
You're listening to KQBH-LP, Los Angeles, California, 101.5 FM, a community service of the Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory. You're listening to the Social Primate with your host, Eddie Aguirre. And today we have the one and only, the award-winning journalist, Michelle Zacarías. How you doing, Michelle?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
First of all, did I pronounce your last name correct?
Yeah.
Oh,
you're one of the few people that have pronounced it correctly.
Okay, I was like, wait a second. As soon as I said it, I was like, did I even say that right?
No, it's Zacarias. I've gotten so used to responding to Zacarias, so I respond to anything now. But, you know how it is, being Latino. So.
Yeah, for real. Real quick on that, I had customer service, they were like, how do you say your last name? I was like, Aguirre. And they're like, oh, you mean Aguirre? And I was like, no. It's Aguirre. Come on now.
That's really far off.
Yeah,
that's not even close.
But to get started, I mean, as I mentioned, you're an award-winning journalist and educator. And over the last couple of years, you've been, really shining the light on the communities out here in Los Angeles and beyond. And honestly, I've read some of your articles, and whether you're reporting on ICE raids, protests, and of course, the shifting in politics of the Latino identity, you've covered a lot of ground over the last couple of years. So I wanted to get a little bit of information about how you got started in all of this and what kind of led you to this, just to kind of talk about community power and solidarity.
Yeah, it's been such a long journey, and it's so bizarre to look back and really think about the original trajectory that I was on. Because growing up, I was very much on the pre-law trajectory. I think there's this running joke that if you have an immigrant parent, they want you to either be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And I hated math and science, so I was going to go into law school, and I took the LSAT. I was really working at a law firm when, in the midst of all of this, the Ferguson uprisings were happening. Mm-hmm. And I remember just being really called to not only learning more and researching more and being in the midst of that, but just writing and amplifying the voice of the people who were kind of on the front line. And so during my lunch breaks, I would write on my personal blog. And then I kind of launched my little ad hoc, guerrilla news outlet. It was a digital news outlet called The Megaphone. And then I used that as a way to essentially land a job at a real news publication. And since then, it's been a lot of learning on the job. And so I'm really proud of the non-traditional pathway into journalism, because a lot of what you can't teach in journalism is the things that come naturally when you have those community relationships, right? Being able to cultivate and develop relationships with people in a genuine way, not in a way that just parachutes into their communities or exploits them or just strips them for a headline. It's really about showing up authentically, developing strong relationships with community members, and then building the trust that you have between, your subject matter and your writing, so that you can really shine light to the nuance and complexity of the story.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. From my understanding, I think you have a bachelor's and a master's degree as well in two different fields. But in terms of that, the master's was in law or something, some sort of.
Yeah, with a master's in studies of law, and the reason I pursued that was because I was doing a lot of coverage of state-sanctioned violence, and that was very much at the beginning of my career was in Chicago, where I was born and raised, and so I was doing a lot of coverage of police misconduct, lawsuits that were happening. And so I wanted to gain that additional knowledge to kind of pad my work, but it's not necessary. I had the luxury and privilege of being able to do that. But there's a lot of other different ways that people who are interested in going or pursuing journalism to gain that knowledge themselves, you just kind of have to be disciplined. But I've been very lucky. I've had the opportunity to pursue multiple degrees and really use that to help pad my work.
Honestly, that's very impressive, again, because I feel in order for you to understand what you're doing as well, you have to look at it from different angles, right? And in this case, it feels like this experience, this knowledge that you've picked up over the last couple of years, it's actually helped the work that you're currently doing now.
Yeah, for sure. Some of it. And also, like right now, the law is really kind of all over the place. It's one of those situations where you can apply what you learned previously and you are still having to learn new material every day because the world is constantly changing. The old rules don't seem to be applying anymore. And even some of my most skilled and equipped lawyer friends are kind of at a loss right now, especially just following everything that's happening right now around immigration raids. You know, there's been such blatant disregard for like due process and people's civil rights.
Definitely. And especially like I mentioned earlier, some of the articles that I definitely been on top of were the ones over the summer that you wrote right at the beginning of the ICE crackdowns. And a lot of it, again, I think it's important to note that it's good to see people that are consistent with the reporting of what they're talking about, especially in moments like this, because it's hard to trust anybody. So when you see somebody on the ground and being consistent with what they're writing about and trying to really show what the real narrative is, I think that takes a lot of courage and a lot of respect for the communities and also for yourselves. Now, some of the work that you've been doing has been through Calo News. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I actually got connected through the UC Berkeley Local News Fellowship. And if you haven't heard about that, definitely check it out. It's this amazing state-funded program, and it essentially creates like residencies for journalists. And we get placed in different newsrooms throughout California. Some of my peers were in, newsrooms up in the Bay, some were in the Central Coast. I was in Los Angeles because I petitioned to be with this specific newsroom. And so we get placed into these residencies and we're there for 2 years. It's a fellowship. You get paid through the university and your focus is on hyperlocal reporting. And a lot of what people think of when they think about like politics that directly impact them in their day-to-day lives actually happen at the local level. And it's so interesting because I think a lot of times the conversation in media is around national politics. But by the time you get to the national politics, it's kind of already too late. You have so many things at a local, hyper-local level in terms of things that you can like vote for, like ordinances, props, things like that, that like really impact your day-to-day and like would be so useful for people in the community to know about if these media outlets were showcasing and covering these things more often.
Now, you mentioned that you were in Chicago the last couple of days, right?
Yeah. So I was visiting home a couple of weeks ago when things started to intensify out there. And it's so interesting because obviously I've been in Los Angeles for several years now. I was here when the raids first started here. And I said back then, people need to be paying attention to what's happening here because they are using Southern California as a testing ground for what they can get away with in the rest of the country.
Yeah.
And we saw exactly that happen. We saw the implementation of things that are now being enacted in other places like Chicago, like DC, like Portland. And not only are they enacting these different strategies and tactics that they used in Southern California back in June and July, but they're also adapting and changing based on what they've learned has or hasn't worked for them. So when I was in Chicago, there was actually a military-style invasion of an apartment complex in a black neighborhood on Chicago's South Side called South Shore. And the way that they carried out this raid was so unlike anything I've seen in terms of reporting. They did this in a way that was, so unconstitutional, but they did it so strategically. They did it at an hour in the morning, like 2 or 3 in the morning, when no one was going to be awake. No one was going to be ready to mobilize. They barricaded the streets so that there was literally no access to this entire city block. The only people that were able to record what were happening were the people that already lived within the confines of that area. And they really did something that I honestly haven't even seen here in Southern California. They just went in and invaded an entire city complex. And they targeted, obviously, Latino, and they targeted black families. And they have children that they were dragging out in the middle of the night. cuffing. They were dragging families out. They left their entire apartments just kind of ransacked. And if you look at the footage or the video of the day after, I mean, they left these apartments completely demolished. And this incident in itself should have made national headlines. And I saw it really only covered by like a few independent, like smaller Chicago-based publications. Chicago Block Club did great coverage of it. The folks from the Invisible Institute took great documentation. There were just some really hyper-local news outlets that did some great coverage of that and followed through with the individuals and residents who lived there in the apartment complex. But there were so few other outlets that really took the time to go back and figure out what had happened. And of course, days later, you see that DHS used this footage as part of their like promotional campaign. So they're like proud of the way in which they violated these people's rights. So this is really something that I think folks need to kind of tune into, because for the longest time we've been talking about this as like a Latino issue, right? And first of all, it's not a Latino issue. It's an everybody issue. First of all, immigration isn't just a Latino issue, right? It's an issue that affects non-Black Latina communities, Black Latina communities, API communities, so many different genres of people. And here we are, you know, now seeing this expand even beyond immigrant communities. Now they're hitting like low income, middle class areas. They're hitting even the white neighborhoods in Chicago on the north side. So this should be a really alarming moment, and it should be a moment that brings people to kind of the urgency of this like matter.
Yeah, you know, and to tie it into the article that you actually wrote back in June 12th, if I'm correct here, which is called In Defiance of ICE, How LA Became the Blueprint in Fighting Authoritarianism. You wrote this back in June, and we're now in October, and we're seeing that actually come true, how it was the blueprint, right? And now it's escalated to another level. And in a sense, like, it's what they want, right? They want to instill that fear. And those tactics are, for anybody seeing this on the outside, not only is it going to get you angry, but those other people who are already affected, that fear is just continuing to be internalized in their communities.
Yes. And I think that's a really important point. It's that the ultimate goal by the larger propaganda machine is to instill fear, right? And so a lot of the coverage that is more mainstream has been about crisis coverage. And there's plenty of that, and it's important because it helps notify our neighbors and community members. But the thing that I wanted to capture in this specific article was that LA is the blueprint because there are so many pockets of resistance happening here. And they're so important to study and examine and use as a template for ways that we can resist throughout the rest of the country. And in Southern California, you've got all of these different kind of sectors of organizers. You've got people that are focused on making sure that ICE agents don't sleep at night, right? No sleep for ICE in LA and Long Beach. You've got folks like Union del Barrio literally doing daily patrols of communities so that they can monitor the federal vehicles that are taking off from Terminal Island and San Pedro Harbor and warn community members about which vehicles to look out for. So there is a lot that I think that can be done, and people contribute in their own different ways, and not everyone has to be at the front lines. But I think that Southern California, and specifically LA, has shown the various methods and ways that people can really mobilize and get involved and plugged into the community.
Now, earlier we had also mentioned about an article that you had written as well, which is debunking Latinos are not a monolith, a nuanced picture beyond the polls, which I think it ties perfectly together to what's currently happening, because we have to look at the root of this to see why we're currently here and we're now facing those consequences. So do you mind telling me a little bit about that article?
Oh, man, I could talk about assimilation politics all day and how it is going to be the death of us, because on one hand, I think that a lot of us understand, right? Like, we grew up with parents or with grandparents who really taught us that assimilation would create exceptionalism. And I think that the construct of the American dream really feeds into this idea that assimilation is exceptionalism. When you conform, when you abide by the rules, you will be treated differently. You are special. nothing bad will happen to you. And on the other hand, as an adult, I can look back at that critically and understand how and why that's a farce. I also get that for a lot of the folks who were in the generation above me, assimilation was a survivalist tactic, right? And for their parents, it was an even more high-risk survivalist tactic. And a lot of people don't really know that, like, Latinos were also segregated in schools. And there was an entire generation of Spanish speakers that were physically disciplined, physically segregated, punished for being Spanish speakers in these school systems. And this was up until like the 70s even. And so they grew up a traumatized generation, and they instilled those kind of values of like fear and like trauma into their children. And their children learned that by conforming and being, good English speakers, and by embracing patriotic values, like they would not be the target of white supremacy, right? And so, I think I look back on my own journey and I have to wonder, like, when did I start questioning these things? Because I also grew up, like a lot of Latinos, thinking that, like, the pathway to exceptionalism was, like, through college and, like, education. And I remember when I was really young, they tried to put me in the English as a second language class. And my mom was like, no. She like pulled me out of that class because she's like, I won't have my daughter being in the segregated class. She'll pick up the language. And I did. And so she had a point, but then I very much forgot my primary language over the years. So, it's so interesting because there's a whole separate conversation we could have about, like, no sabo kids and that generation of, like, broken Spanish speakers. But, like, that is a byproduct of an assimilist society.
Yeah, and, now that you mentioned that, I remember back in, like, elementary school, ESL was considered, like, why are you in ESL? Like, it was, like, an other thing.
Yeah.
Again, all that does is just continue fracturing us amongst each other.
Yeah.
So, like, and that's at a young age. Like, that's already indoctrinating us so early on to think that, oh, well, we have English as a first language. I'm better than you.
Yeah, but also it's crazy because these, like, wealthy parents will literally pay to have Spanish-speaking nannies or, different language-speaking, like, nannies raise their children so that they can have access to multilingualism, right? That was such a gift and a privilege, and we were treated as though it was a nuisance. And so, even now, thinking about how our generation is learning and adapting from and moving away from that, I am hopeful, and I think that, like, we are able to think more critically through some of, like, the things that we were conditioned to believe as children.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point to bring up because, like you mentioned earlier, assimilation to our parents or grandparents was a form of survival. Like, I clearly remember my parents keeping their head low, telling us to keep our head low because that's how we were going to move forward. And interestingly enough, as soon as I got older and I started interacting as an adult in the world, I started seeing that no matter how American I try to present myself, they will always see me as a brown kid.
Right.
And you will feel it based on the energies or interactions and, like, oh, you're not in this position yet to be here. It's like, what?
Right.
But you have that value, right?
And I wish someone would tell that to those Latino ICE agents and those Latino Border Patrol agents because I'm constantly trying to come from a place of understanding nowadays because I really feel like we have less than 4 years to work on shifting the narrative and really meeting people where they're at. Yeah. But I can't wrap my head around what it's like to be on the other side of that line, being aligned with an entity that's desecrating your community, your family. I just really don't have a clear pathway to empathy for those people who choose to align with white supremacy at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I've had the conversation with different people who I know, and they're close to me as well, that I know they initially voted for Trump. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that there were single issue voters. And it all comes down to the whole thing where you're like, okay, so you're nitpicking what you want to vote for, but you're overlooking everything else. So I'm trying to understand where that comes from, where you overlook like the bigger issues that are actually affecting people who you grew up with.
Right. And man, there are so many layers to that, and I've had so many different conversations around this specific subject matter because, the big talking point after the election was like the increase in male Latino voters that voted for Trump. And I really took the time to kind of dissect that because there's so much here, right? Like, on one hand, yes, there is misogyny. Yes, there is anti-Blackness. Yes, there is like a hyper-religious kind of ideology for a lot of Latinos, not just men. But also, like, Latino men are, at the end of the day, men. And they are fed the same stream of misinformation and are targeted with the same kind of disinformation that young men are between the ages of like 17 to like 27, right? And a lot of that is like specifically fed to them, and it gives them, a sense of community and belonging. And it's really interesting because I've been talking to my friends a little bit about like what does that look like? What does that mean? To have like this demographic of, Latino males that voted against their communities or against their quote unquote interests. And it is complicated. It is like, men trying to find community and solidarity in whatever capacity they can. Yeah. It is a lot of targeted disinformation. It is a lot of cultural like layers embedded in there, like things that we as Latinos haven't really like openly acknowledged, like, anti-Blackness and misogyny. But I think beyond that, like, like there's so much there. And the bottom line is like, I think that there is a difference between people that are kind of like caught up in just like the traditions and values that they were raised in. And then there are people that are like directly aligning themselves with like white supremacist values or joining entities like ICE. And I recently had a conversation with a group of people about how like ICE is now becoming like the new military recruitment, right? Like they're preying on people because they're saying, we'll wipe out your student debt. We'll give you a signing bonus.
Yeah.
So
like the military, right?
Exactly. So for a lot of young Latino men, that's actually going to be a new pathway into stability, employment, all of those things.
Yeah, and I can speak on part of that because when I was in high school, me and a couple of friends, I think that was 2007, 2008. So they were recruiting for the Marines at high school. And at some point I was like, you know what? I think I can pull it off. I think I can be a Marine. So I took the test. I scored pretty good. And at some point I started like getting anxiety. I was like, you know what? I don't think I want to do this anymore. And the recruiter will still come and try to persuade you to show up and all that stuff. My other friends ended up going. I did not go. But what basically what you're saying right now is that it was a way out. Like it was a way to envision yourself in a better place in your community than you were currently at, right? But that only came, and this is me speaking for myself, that only came because I was not confident in my ability to provide, to be more than what I could be at that time in my life.
Right.
So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of these individuals sometimes get, I don't know, hijacked in a sense, because it's an escape. It's a means of progressing, but at the cost of your soul, in a sense, right?
Right. And it's treated as a form of social mobility that's the alternative to college, right? And I think that's the mistake. It's like, oh, if you do really well in school, you go to college. But like, if you don't have that option, what's the alternative? And military is like statistically the easiest alternative to that, right? You get money, you get stability, you get housing. And I think this is why I'm now kind of concerned about like the trajectory of young men into like, for example, federal agent pathway. So I do, and it is it's predatory. You're asking a child essentially to sign his life away. And like you said, at what cost? Like I've had so many friends and former partners who were veterans, and they are dealing with terrible mental health issues. They are, not being employed at the capacity that they were promised they were going to be employed, right? Because their skill sets don't directly translate to anything once you get out, unless you do like a specific job in the military. Yeah. So there's like so much, once a person is actually out of the military, they're really discarded and forgotten in a lot of ways. And I think that's the thing that I have to reiterate, like, hey, like this is a good for now, but like at the end of the day, like you're still serving a government you can't just decide one day, all right, this is against my values or against what I believe in, and I'm going to leave. Like, once you sign the dotted line, you are obligated to serve. It's not a job. You can quit a job at any time, you know? And I think that's the part that's not fully articulated when you sign.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And then, I mean, at the end of the day, you're also looking at your environment and your situation and where you're at. And of course, that's going to play a big role in how you make these decisions, right? I also actually, I'm not going to give names on this one because I don't think it deserves a platform in that sense of this opinion. But it was in relation to what's kind of going on with ICE and all that stuff. And this individual was basically speaking to how they're pro ICE stuff going on. And basically, what he ends up saying is that when his parents came here, they came through, I think that was like in the 80s, I think when Ronald Reagan,
gave amnesty?
Yeah. So
yeah.
they came in, oh, well, it was all circumstantial.
Yeah.
Because then it turns into, oh, well, my parents came in here, they did it the right way at the right time. And now everybody else, well, the law changed, so they're criminals, so they have to follow the law. And it comes down to the fact that, I don't know if this is it stems or connects at all, but going back to the assimilation and survival tactics, like, you had to follow law and order in order for you to become assimilated, right?
Right.
But at some point, when we get older, do we continue processing that as a reality rather than stepping out and seeing, okay, wait a second, why is it this way? And I think a lot of the times we don't grow past that. So we continue thinking that law and order is what's going to be the right thing and the pillar of everything that's true, right?
Right. And I mean, honest to God, criminality is a social construct because we literally have a president who is a criminal in office. So I could care less about that talking point or that viewpoint because it's not real. It's just something that people kind of apply based on how it suits them or how it favors their argument. But I think the thing that you're talking about that's important is that a lot of times when these people are talking about my parents did this the right way, my relatives did this the right way, a lot of people who are currently being detained and deported are doing it the right way. Yeah. There are people who are being kidnapped from courthouses after going to their immigration hearings. There are people that have, permanent citizenship or temporary visas or DACA recipients that are legally allowed to be here in the United States, and they are still being deported. If you haven't heard about the Latino journalist who was on the job reporting and then got detained by ICE and was still basically detained and deported, I mean, that is someone who not only has like freedom of the press, right? Like, he is working as a journalist doing his job, but then he was essentially abducted and deported, and that's like that's the precedent that they're setting. So, there's so many like counter examples to the things that people are bringing up now. The right way argument, we know that's not true. Otherwise, they wouldn't just be grabbing American citizens, which they are doing, like Amanda Treybeck. Or, the young boy who got snatched up in Pico Rivera.
Yeah.
So it just, all of these talking points feel like tired and played out. And they also feel like you're not paying attention. You're not actually looking and seeing how this is different. Like, this isn't a targeted abduction. This isn't a targeted raid. They're not serving search warrants. They're not identifying themselves. They're not showing anything, and the reason is because they know what they're doing is illegal. Yeah. What they're doing is on the wrong side of history. I'm sorry, there's no way in hell that you're walking around with your face covered if you're standing 10 toes down on what you're doing.
Yeah, and one thing that just continues to play in my head is just the fact, like, sure, you're in this position right now, you're following the law or you're following orders, right? But at some point, that takes a toll in your humanity. I would say, like, that's forever, as long as you're alive, not just momentary for what we're currently seeing. So, like, how does one carry that weight in them, and still try to, rationalize with that it's right?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I have had conversations with, like, Latino Trump supporters, and I've tried to kind of understand where the rationale is. I ran into a Latino Trump supporter at like the Weekend concert, and I dedicated like 40 plus minutes of my life just trying to understand, because on a lot of points, he seemed to understand and recognize that ICE agents raiding his community, kidnapping his neighbors were not a good thing. And I remember I was just kind of like asking questions. His mom was an immigrant. Like, there were just all these little things. And I remember at one point he was like, I know what you want me to say. Like, you want me to say F Donald Trump. And I was like, no, what I actually want is just recognition that you might make a different decision next time around. That's it. And I think there's like a weird like stubbornness or like unwillingness to like really recognize the consequences of your actions, right? Because I do think that a lot of people voted thinking that this wasn't going to be the case. Like, there is some things that have played out over the last year that people did not expect. And we're seeing that. Like, we're seeing people kind of backtrack on their support. So I do think that there is a shift happening. But there's still so much, absolutely so much right-wing propaganda. There is so much just kind of white nationalism that's widespread, not just in our communities, not just in Latino communities, but at the government level.
Now, going a little bit back to the article that we were mentioning earlier, what other information can you tell us about what the polls showed, what the results were for that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here that I can cover. First of all, I want to name that I mentioned the journalist before who was deported. His name is Mario Guevara, and he was a Salvadorian journalist who was legally allowed to work here, and he was detained and deported to El Salvador. And this is the first time that a member of the press had been detained while covering and deported. So I just want to name that because I think it's important to kind of name the people and not just people have to understand like there are human beings behind these stories. But yeah, I guess kind of like looking at the different things that I covered post-election, there was just a lot of, I want to say, numbers that I looked at that felt really important. And one of them was that it wasn't just that the Republicans had inspired a new wave of Latino male voters. There was some of that. But the reality was that the Democrats had actually lost like 13 million voters since the previous election. And, you know, if you look at my coverage, if you look at my previous work, you know that I have all the smoke for both parties across the aisle. And so I really do want to, you know, kind of name that the Democratic Party has failed a lot of people. Yeah. It feel like it's failed working class communities. It has not incentivized or mobilized people to vote for anything. It has mostly just ridden on this wave of voting against Donald Trump for the last several election cycles, you know. So I think that's, you know, a failure on their part. I think they're also just really unable to connect to like the working class. And that will always be, you know, my biggest critique of politics is there's so much focus on identity politics in like a racial sense. And right now they love to hyperfixate on queer and trans folks, even though they're a very small, vulnerable part of the population. But the reality is, in order to get people excited about something and mass mobilize the vote, they need to really tap into the poor and working class community.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's what makes it incentivizing for others when they see, you know, Donald Trump spewing all this word vomit, and they hear something that relates to what their human needs are. They're like, okay, but this is the guy. This is the guy who I have to vote for. But then you start overlooking everything else, and that's the problem with that. And it goes back to the thing I mentioned earlier about the single issue voters. Like at the end of the day, like you have to take into consideration that there's a lot of this is multifaceted. Like you have to understand that, and you can't just act on one emotion of things, you know. And speaking as a male, you know, as a Latino man, I think a lot of the times it also has to do with just, and I see this as a problem with a lot of Latino men, and it's the fact that there's, how do I say it? There's no real guidance for a lot of men. So for them to see this figure that is supposed to symbolize this machista, like, oh, this tough guy, it's easy for them to latch onto that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think, you know, even seeing or being exposed to so many young men of color, like, I can have great relationships with them, but if they're voting against my rights, my reproductive rights, or things like that, it's like, where are we actually at in terms of our relationship? Is there a level of respect? Like, do you look up to me the same way that you would another man? And I think there's something about like having community with other men that's so important. I think there's like probably a mental health conversation there too, like why men are uncomfortable being vulnerable with one another, because I think some of those really difficult conversations could be dissected in that way. Like, if you can be vulnerable with another man, then like maybe you can challenge your own thoughts and opinions about something,
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I love being a woman. It's like I talk to my girlfriends all the time and I throw ideas around, and I am constantly challenged and I'm constantly trying to learn from them. And I take pride in trying to surround myself with people who might know more than me. And I remember having a conversation with someone pretty recently where he said, I'm really scared to be the dumbest person in the room. And I like never thought about like why that would be a scary situation for him. And it, like, honestly, at his core, it's about feeling emasculated.
Yeah. I mean, that's where a lot of it stems from. And I think, while I was doing my research in this conversation, it started hitting a lot of those points where, like, I feel like there definitely is, it's always going to be that, like, the emasculation part, like feeling that type of way about it. And unless you have something that's going to guide you, like, you're going to make some decisions in those moments of isolation, and it's a mental health thing for guys. Honestly, it is. And I see it. I've heard it. I hear how people talk about it and how they make it seem like that's the way to do things. And it's just like nah, like you need to talk to some other dudes and go into some support groups or something, exchange ideas. Cause that's how we challenge these, what am I saying here?
Yeah. The preconceptions that we have and things that we've been conditioned to believe, for sure.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned this in the last episode, but I had done this little mini clip where I came across this gentleman called Jack, and I had this interaction with this Latino man, and the Latino man was pro-ICE, and the other guy, Jack, who was a white guy, he was against it. So I was like what? Like, no ICE? He was putting no ICE stickers, and it was just, the roles were reversed. So I was like, how do we get here? Like this Latino man has been raised out here in Southeast LA. You know what the struggle is like. Like, how do you stay to that?
I mean, my very Psych 101 answer would probably be like, that white person probably has never had to abide by assimilation politics, right, as a survival mechanism. So he's had the liberty to question these systems, whereas so many young Latino men have been told, like, if you align yourself with these systems of power, you will also have access to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where people will get hooked on that, because they feel like that proximity to power means that they have that power.
Exactly. And, that's what's so interesting is, like, when you look at the, I guess, intersections of Latinos that align themselves with, like, ICE or with white supremacist groups, it's not, like, just light-skinned Latinos. And obviously there is colorism in our community, but there's a lot of brown Latinos that are out there.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see how powerful those, I guess, like, types of brainwashings or that kind of misinformation can really embed themselves into someone's psyche, because they're not seeing themselves as, like, brown men or brown individuals. They're seeing themselves as, like, the exception. Yeah, no, and that's a killer right there. I think especially with the narrative that we're seeing, with the Department of Justice and Department of, air quotes, war and all this stuff, same thing. It all points to the machista part to it. Like, oh, we need to be fit, we need to look good, like, we need to be strong. And it goes back to that whole thing where you're like, okay, you feel like your manhood's in a sense being attacked, like the version of America that you feel is almighty. It's like, okay, right. Then you'll align yourself to it. It's so funny because Idiocracy got it so right. And I don't know if you've ever seen that movie.
I haven't.
This movie came out, like, I want to say decades ago, definitely over a decade ago. And when I watched it the first time, I was like, this is insane. Like, there's no, and it's a literal, it's like a play-by-play of what's happening with our government right now. But the idea behind it is that, like, people have evolved to become so like dumb or like low IQ that like anything goes in government. But at the root of it, they're also talking about like what you're discussing. It's like these like themes of like masculinity in government, and President Camacho comes out and he like plays his guitar and he's like ripped, and he played by like Terry Crews, who's like the epitome of manhood, you know? So it's like so funny because it is kind of how a lot of people see Donald Trump, even though he's this like old man who is wealthy, right? He's like the farthest thing from like a strong masculine person. He's just protected by his wealth and obviously his powerful and affluent friends.
Yeah. You know, and it's interesting that you bring that up because on Instagram, you know, I'll be following like random pages. Like there's this one called Interesting Facts or Interesting History. And eventually you start seeing how they start uploading posts that talk about like just how to be a better man, get your money, don't worry about girls. And like all this stuff that is pointing to this right-wing version of thinking. And you're like, wait, what? Like they're here trying to control you with the messaging. And a lot of these people are eating it up. A lot of these men are eating it up. And you see it, and you know that there's vulnerable men out there who are just waiting to latch onto something like this. You know, and they move forward with it, and that's why they see these individuals that, air quotes, radiate power, and they
right. And then they're complaining about the male loneliness epidemic, but like, bro, no one wants to be with someone who is that self-absorbed and thinks of their partner as like their property or an extension of their property, right? And I think that's the difficulty. It's like there are a lot of people, I think, who would love to connect with those individuals, but they're choosing to align themselves with these like specific communities that are feeding into that self-isolation.
Yeah.
And you're right, like it is about like being plugged into your community, but also having like that mentorship and that guidance in those spaces. And that's, I mean, very similarly to why young men end up in like gangs, right? Like gangs create sort of like this community and this hub and this protection that they wouldn't otherwise have in a vulnerable state.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is what I personally see as maybe one of these bridges that connect people into voting the way they did. And this is just from my personal experience as a guy. But obviously, you know, the data does give you a different version of that.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I also found while I was doing my research for this article was, first of all, like, I think there's this, like, misconception that, like, Latino male voters could have, like, shifted the tides of the election. And that's generally not true, just because of the way that the electoral system is set up. So, yes, they are an important voting demographic, but not enough of a voting demographic that would have changed the tides of the election. Also, because we're looking at Latinos as an overall voting base, Latinas have always historically and even now mostly voted in favor of the Democratic Party. And they vote more than Latino males do. So I think this is not to like downplay the problems or the issues in our community. I just feel like this has become kind of like the running talking point. Like, what are we going to do? This is like internal communal work we got to do, right? Like that's the ongoing work. That's not really just for the next 4 years. This is a forever thing. But I think that when we're thinking about how the next election cycle might go, we do really want to, again, look at the areas and states that were forgotten by the Democratic Party. Places that they didn't even bother to go to. They didn't bother to like mobilize voters. And so I'm, just thinking about the forgotten demographics of Latinos in different places outside of like the general areas that people know they're supposed to be in, right? Like everyone knows Latinos exist in Los Angeles and everyone knows we exist in New York and Chicago, but we're like not a monolith, and we have so many different types of Latinos, right? Like Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and there are some demographics of Latinos that have always and historically leaned conservative. And a big part of that is because of, policies like what happened under Reagan. And of course, Cubans have leaned conservative.
Yeah. I mean, one thing to mention too, I mean, outside of what we're currently seeing in the political climate as of right now, we've also seen that even prior to this administration, there was already fragmentation within our communities in different forms and different shapes and forms, you know? So I think when we look at it that way, like you mentioned earlier, this is a community thing that we have to focus on because it's going to change with each administration that comes along. And until we really figure out what that cause is, you know, we're not going to move forward necessarily.
Right. And so that's what I'm saying. I'm like, this is an ongoing thing. I mean, we know that this last election, Republicans secured like some very key important states, according to Edison research, if anybody wants to look it up. But they were able to get places like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And those are not large voting demographics for Latinos. So I think that there are a lot of different projects happening right now, like intercommunal projects, investing in youth, providing guidance and mentorship, helping, you know, these very young, vulnerable Latino men, or actually boys who are going to become men, you know, have pathways to stability and security. And that's really hard right now because our economy is shot. People are being snatched up. There's a lot of fear. But providing safety and security and stability is kind of like the first step.
Now, having done this work over the last couple of months, over the summer more specifically, has that shifted anything within you in terms of like, you know, how you want to keep moving forward with your work, or what does that look like, especially now that you saw LA and Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's been rough. I feel like one of the things that people don't really know about Chicago is that Donald Trump has had this long-standing beef with Chicago because during the first campaign that he ran, he tried to set up a speaking arrangement in Chicago, and we ran him out. And I remember this was 2017, around the start of my journalism career, maybe a couple years in, and there were so many people that showed up, and they were so ready to shut this down, and he didn't even get to get on stage, you know? And I just remember that moment and feeling like the most pride I had ever felt in my city. Like, nobody could mess with us. No one could touch us. I just know this man has been stewing. He's just been stewing and sitting on this. He's had it out for us since even before then, right? Fast forward to June and July of this last year, and I'm covering the raids that were happening in Los Angeles County and Southern California, and just seeing the way in which people rose up, that they fought back, that they stood up and protected their neighbors. That was the closest I have ever experienced to feeling that same pride again. And it was the first time that I remember thinking like, oh, this is home. Like, I could not have chosen a better city to move to. Because in so many ways, Chicago and LA are kind of like sibling cities. We have the same conviction, the same grit. We have the same love for our people and communities. We are, you know, if nothing else, a culmination of our different communities and ethnic background and racial background and economic background. And that's what makes each of our cities like what it is. And so even now, having seen and witnessed everything that I have over the course of like all this time reporting on so much crisis and devastation, I feel so inspired by the people who are standing up against this authoritarian regime. I feel so emboldened to continue reporting and being on the front line of this until I can't anymore. And I think now I'm really going into this understanding that this is a marathon, right? This is not a sprint. We have to lean on each other. We have to connect with one another. We have to show up for one another. And I'm going to continue doing that in whatever way I can as a journalist and as a reporter until it's not possible for me to do that any longer.
Yeah, and also Portland, I've seen the videos of those people in the frog suits and all that stuff. And just seeing stuff like that amongst everything we're seeing, it's like,
They're literally throwing the absurdity back in their faces. That Portland is so
Exactly.
weird. And like, I'll just say, like, I feel like Chicago, LA, we're so gritty, we're so serious about our resistance, but I just love that Portland is like so serious and unserious about it, you know?
I mean, they had that emergency naked protest too.
Yeah.
Like what? Like that's crazy. But again, it just shows that, like you just said perfectly, around the absurdity we have to, in a sense, fight back with, right? And
Right.
it just elevates us, I think, even further, because it shows that we're standing up to these individuals who are militarized, who are, weapons that are less lethal, and you're like, nah, I don't care. I'm gonna show up there, and we're gonna stand up.
Yeah. And you know what? Like, I think that these people in their COD cosplay and their little military warfare, modern warfare get up, like, they're scary. And they would not feel as emboldened and entitled to brutalize people as they have if they didn't have their weapons on their side, if they didn't have 100 other dudes in the same gear around them, because there's so many more of us than there are of them. And I sometimes, as I'm covering these like frontline events and I'm at protests or I'm at, raids or things get escalated, I can see these people, I see their eyes and there's panic there, there's something happening internally where they're either panicked, they're not sure, they're uncertain. And I am reminded that, okay, there is a human being behind this mask. They might not be a good human being, but there is someone there. And that makes me feel like a little more secure, I guess, just understanding and knowing, because that's a human being standing alongside their peers, but I'm also standing along my people.
Yeah, and that's powerful. And I've had the opportunity to be at some of the protests as well, and just the energy that you see, especially early on in Southeast LA. We had raids in the city of Bell, and just having people show up and come out, and even after all that, just to come out and play music and dance and just convivir together, you're like, this is what it's about, like this is what's gonna help us get out of here. And so when I'm seeing these videos in Chicago, when people are standing up and they're scaring them away and standing up for each other, like people, we don't know each other, but we're still there for each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they can't ever take away from us.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful to be able to kind of cover this and do the work that I do in this moment, because I don't know what it would feel like to be helpless or to feel like I couldn't do something about this in this moment. And there's so many people that are using all of their privileges right now to really stand up for the folks who are undocumented, who can't be arrested, who can't be on the front lines. And I'm really happy to see that there are people from all walks of life, all races, all ethnic backgrounds really like showing up.
Yeah. And now, before we start wrapping this up, like, what kind of advice can you give somebody listening to this, somebody who's feeling lost in all of this?
Oh my God. I don't have like a one size fits all answer for this. I think that right now we have to kind of mentally prepare for the next 4 years and beyond. And that means that you are finding your people. You're finding the communities, the people that make you feel safe, that make you feel protected. You are learning and educating yourself about ways that you can help and assist and contribute. I think there are so many different ways that we can all participate, and not all of it means having to be at the front lines, right? Some of it means creating safe bases for people. Some of it means distributing food, or buying out your local vendor who is at risk when they're sitting out there all day on the corner. There are so many different ways for us to kind of stand up and say this isn't right. And you just have to find your niche and what feels good to you. And just always continue to check in on yourself, check in on your neighbors. And if you see something that's not right, like, stand up and say something about it. I know it's scary, and we are all in fear of losing what little we have. But I think right now, this moment is just so much bigger than that.
Yeah. And honestly, shout out to you. I mean, I saw that you were on the ground with Mariah a couple months ago too. Just
Yeah, getting brutalized. Yeah.
brutalized.
Yeah. It was, it was a really unexpected because that was the No King protest, and the entire day was really mostly peaceful. All of the protesters there were just dancing, hanging out. It felt like a cookout, like people were chill. And it was really the presence of the National Guard and the LAPD and the LASG and then the Marine that really escalated things. And, I think this is a testament to the disorganization because they at one point were shooting tear gas at each other, and you could hear it on the police radio, blue on blue. And there's no actual cohesive organization happening there. And so when I do coverage, I go out there, I try my best to report on everything that's happening. But I will say, all while we're at this, giant central protest, there were other communities that were being hit. Downey was still being hit. I remember East LA was still being hit. And they will take advantage of the fact that there's a lot of folk kind of centrally located somewhere. So just be on the lookout for your neighbors, check in with them, make sure that they know, their rights and that they're able to kind of practice that with you if they have to. Because, we can't all be everywhere all at once. And I will say that is one thing I will leave you with. If it's like any solace or wisdom, a friend from Chicago recently told me, you cannot be everywhere all at once, but you can be, something to someone somewhere, right? And that's where I'm going to position myself for now.
No, and it's a great way to end that because, again, at the end of the day, we're going to have each other. And I know for a long time, or at least over the summer, we were focused on going up to the detention facilities and protesting outside of that. But I read somewhere that I think like the best thing we could do is just create rapid response networks around our homes, or around our communities, where we can actually have people spread out in different parts of our communities looking out for each other rather than, like you mentioned, going to one spot and giving them the options to attack everybody else when they're there.
And if you're really wanting to get involved in something like that, Union del Barrio has amazing patrol trainings. There's so many like little local, I guess, like community patrols that are happening. And you just have to plug into it. And it really is just hanging out in your neighborhood and keeping an eye on your neighbors and alerting them if something's going down. But yeah, there's just so many little ways that we can contribute. So I am such a fan of rapid response community patrols. I think they're so much more effective than like large scale protests.
I agree. No, Michelle, thank you so much for making the time to come out here. For people who want to find out more about your work or just keep updated with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, you guys can obviously follow my work at Galo News. I was also recently made the new host of the Latino newsletter podcast. So yeah, I'm going to have my own podcast soon. So definitely follow the Latino newsletter, Galo News. And if you want to find me on IG, you can follow me at malignant_media.
Hey, Michelle, thank you so much for making that time. It was an honor speaking with you. Everybody else, we're signing off. This is KQBH 101.5 FM, and you just finished listening to the Social Primate. And we'll see you guys next week. Peace out.
Us black and brown. You hear the gun make a sound. You hear my voice make it loud. They aim at us cause we proud. They aim at us black and brown. You hear the gun make a sound. You hear my voice make it loud. You aim at us cause we proud.
Mira, mira, es la policía. Cuida, cuida, los niños y las niñas. Ría, ría, es pura porquería. Migra, migra, cuiden su familia.
The hope against humanity. Turn the TV off, but they still see you with the screens. Watching from above, yeah, they know just where you be. Everywhere I go, I feel like someone's watching me. Watch out, es la policía. Cuidado con la placa, quieren quitarme la
overseas. We will no longer be the minorities. About to take the badge and the gun from the police.
Black and brown, you hear the gun make a sound. You hear my voice make it loud. They aim at us cause we proud. They aim at us black and brown. You hear the gun make a sound. You hear my voice make it loud. You aim at us cause we proud. Watch out, they bout to murder sons.
Watch out, got the badge and the gun.
Watch out, come before you better run.
Watch out, revolution has begun.
Every day, the pain, killing the people going insane. Kids in the grave, who is to blame? It's the people, the power, the fame.
Poison our brain, but the bodies remain. Skeleton missing, forgetting their names. Why are the people in chains, digging the dirt on the government, funding political games?
They aim at us black and brown. You hear the gun make a sound. You hear my voice make it loud. They aim at us cause we proud. They aim at us black and brown. You hear the gun make a sound. You hear my voice make it loud. You aim at us cause we You hear my voice make it loud.
Can you stand it?